I'll admit, up until this point you probably know me from one of my videos about math, but I have a question for you. You know what has a lot of math? Games. Games have a lot of math. With that segue out of the way, I'd like to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Some of you may already play Dungeons & Dragons, but most of you are probably rolling your eyes at the game that you think is only for nerds and people who exclusively play video games in their parents' basement. And while plenty of those demographics do play D&D, there are also tons of other people of varying interests that can all center around the hobby. So, the first question, what's Dungeons & Dragons? D&D is one specific game in a genre of games called tabletop role-playing games. So, what's a tabletop role-playing game? I'm glad you asked! Let me paint you a picture. Envision back to the days when you went camping, or at a quiet moment during a party. One person, let's say his name was AJ, begins telling a fictional story. He weaves the start of the tale with lush forests, trees, bushes, and a brisk pitter-patter of a waterfall in the distance. In other words, he paints a scene. Then AJ begins describing a hero of the tale, Farah, and after describing what she looks like, AJ points to one of his spectators of the story, one of his friends around the story circle, and says, "Alright, Alice, you're playing as Farah." AJ then does this once for every person in the circle listening to his story, and so each of the other spectators, who are now players, each have a character in the story, and AJ guides what the group of players come across. That's it. Yep, that's it. That's the entire concept of a tabletop RPG. It's simply an improvised story guided by one person, referred to as the Game Master, leading a bunch of players who each play as a character in the story. So we know what a tabletop role-playing game is, but then what's D&D? Well, I think any specific tabletop RPG can be described by two key factors. One, the beings, items, and locations that populate the world, and two, the rules and mechanics of the game. For example, Dungeons & Dragons is populated with humans, elves, dwarves, half-elves, halflings, gnomes, orcs, dire rats, wolves, beholders, mind flayers, and of course, Dungeons and Dragons. It has adventure occupations such as fighter, ranger, rogue, bard, barbarian, wizard, sorcerer, warlock, and countless others. It has numerous planes of existence such as the material plane, the Fey realm, the Underdark, and tons more. These are the things that populate the world. Now, rules on the other hand, well, there's multiple hundreds of pages of rules. But what if I told you that you could shrink it down into its core components, and beyond that, those components don't require any actual physical table pieces at all? You can theoretically play D&D tomorrow with your friends entirely for free. But to do that, we need to know some extremely basic rules. So, the first thing to know, when players want to do something, the game could devolve into a toddler's game of pretend if we don't set some ground rules. In other words, there has to be a way to determine if things succeed or fail. Well, we could say that the Game Master determines if things succeed or fail, but we want to judge to be as impartial as possible. And what's the most impartial thing that exists? Randomness. So let's grab some dice to determine if things the players do will succeed or fail. In D&D, you roll a 20-sided die and the Game Master determines a number above which the players must roll. This number is commonly referred to as difficulty class, or DC. So let's say AJ determines that you must roll strictly above a 10 in order to cross a 5-foot gap with a pit of spikes in the center. 10 is a relatively average difficulty, and a 5-foot gap is a relatively average challenge. For those viewers who already understand D&D rules, let's make it a simple example by saying that there are no modifiers. So Alice, who is playing as Farah, would tell AJ that she would like to leap across the gap. AJ would then determine the difficulty of the check, 10 in this case. Then Alice would roll for Farah's leap. Alice rolls a 12 on her 20-sided die, and then AJ describes how Farah reaches across to the other side of the gap, landing safely. In a different example, if Alice rolled an 8 on her 20-sided die, Farah may instead not be able to get all the way across the gap, instead clinging to the edge of the other side with one hand, and scrapes her leg on one of the spikes below. She would take some damage, and now there's a new challenge for the players to get her out of the pit. In addition to success or failure, Alice could have also rolled a 20 on the die itself. This is known as a critical success. In this example, Farah may leap across the gap successfully, and AJ may add some extra flair to the leap, such as doing an entire front flip in the process. Remember, a 20 on the die does not mean something good happens. It just means that you do the thing you were trying to do very well. However, Alice could have also rolled a 1 on the die itself. This is known as a critical failure. In this case, Farah may slip at the edge of the spike pit, falling directly into a spike and getting partially impaled. This would be a dire situation in which she or the other players would need to get her out of there, or risk a party member and traveling companion's entire life. And yes, the characters that players play as can die. That is a subject that can be in its own video, so I won't go into much detail here. Okay, so the players control characters, and they roll dice to see if they succeed or fail. They can succeed very strongly or fail very strongly if luck wills it to be so. The final thing I want to talk about is stats. Vanilla D&D Rules has tons of stats for different things, but you could theoretically play an entire game and never go beyond the following stats. 1. Health, and 2. The 6 foundational D&D stats. Health is self-explanatory. If you run out of it, you go unconscious or die, depending on how you and your group play. Remember before when I said, let's assume there's no modifiers? The 6 foundational D&D stats are those modifiers. Those stats are Strength, which determines your physical prowess, Dexterity, which determines your swiftness and capability to manipulate your hands, Constitution, which determines your hardiness and capability to avoid sickness, Intelligence, which determines your academic knowledge and spellcasting ability, Wisdom, which determines your survivalist knowledge, knowledge gained from experience, and capability to defend against magic. And finally, Charisma, which determines your ability to persuade, convince, intimidate, coerce, or otherwise communicate. Let's say your strength had a modifier of +3. That means that you are particularly strong, and if your task was to lift a boulder, it would become a bit easier. Let's say you needed to roll strictly above a 15 to lift a boulder. If Alice, playing as Farah with a +3 strength modifier, rolled a 13 on the die to move a boulder, Alice would report to AJ a total of 16, since her die roll plus her modifier is a total of 16. In other words, Farah gets a sizable bonus every time she needs to do something related to strength, and is better at doing tasks such as moving boulders than other characters. And truth be told, that's all the rules you necessarily need to know in order to play. There's tons of important information to know before you get really good at playing or running a game as a game master. But ultimately, the goal is for everyone around the table to have fun. If that's achieved, and players aren't left with an uncomfortable feeling, then the game was a success. This video is meant to be mostly informational rather than as a guide on how to have a fun game or run a fun game, but I do want to make sure I briefly touch on something so I can post this video in good conscience. Get a good idea of the sort of game your players want to play. You could gather the world's best players and best game master, and the game could still be less than enjoyable if the group dynamic doesn't work. If you think a group will work, and even if you don't think a group will work, at least give it a try, and be honest if the group dynamic isn't working well. And if it isn't working well, then disband the game and look for a new group. I will be the first to admit that 95% of what you get from a D&D game is based off of the group in which you play. And try pitching it to friends that haven't played before. You'd be wildly surprised at how many of those new players might enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. Well, that's all I've got for today. Let me know if you found this video valuable, and especially so if you're screaming at your computer that you already know all of this stuff and want to know more about how to play or run a game. I'd be happy to do more videos about those topics in the future, and in the meantime, have a great day.